going to go ahead and try to get started because we do have a lot to try to cover today. And getting through all my material is not my strong suit. So I want to try to give us as much time as possible. A couple things I want to review from last week as we get started, just as way a reminder of why studying the Old Testament is important, but particularly why studying the Pentateuch matters. The first 5 books of the Old Testament. Why does that matter? And I know we talked about last week the sort of surround sound. Everybody remember this? That you have what's how surround sound works. You have multiple speakers that are essentially playing the same song, but playing a little bit different parts of it. That when you have them all together, that's when you understand the music best. That's when you get the full version. So that it's the same thing over and over and over again. So if you've got this big story arc of the Bible of creation and fall and longing and redemption and final consummation, you have the same story being told in a microcosm over and over and over. That's one, it's just good storytelling, but it's especially for the Hebrews, that's how they communicated. That's why when you read the Psalms, that's why the psalmists use repetition. That's why when you read the prophets, if you go read Isaiah, what you're going to see is the same thing over and over and over again, that he'll prophesy the same things from beginning to end, and then come back right and start back where he started before and prophesy the same things but from a slightly different angle, that he's just saying the same things over and over and over again, so that you get this full-orbed view, so that what we're going to see is the same story arc over and over and over again in the Old Testament, that helps to give us categories and prepare us for what this big picture is and what the Lord's doing in the work of Jesus, so that all these things are shaped and modeled after the big storyline that point us to Christ. And I thought about, I know one of the things we talked about last week with the Pentateuch is it gives you all this background knowledge that then helps the rest of the Old Testament to make sense. That if you misunderstand or don't know anything about the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, then the rest of the Old Testament, there's often just pieces that are not going to make sense to you. Therefore, the New Testament sometimes is going to be confusing because you can't understand the Old Testament, and you can't understand the Old Testament without understanding the Pentateuch, that there is some necessary knowledge. I thought about that this week. I saw a commercial. I think it's for AT&T. I'm not even honestly sure. That tells you how well the commercial worked. I'm not sure what the product was, but anybody see this commercial? There's a guy in a hospital bed. He and his wife are there, and there's a nurse, and they ask the nurse, well, have you worked with Dr. Johnson before? And she says, oh, yeah, he's okay. And then just about that time, you see the doctor, he's coming into the room, and he sort of yells down the hall, hey, guess who just got reinstated? And he steps in and says, well, not officially yet. And he says to the guy, are you nervous? He says, oh, yeah. He says, well, me too. Man, it's okay. We'll figure it out. See you in there. And then he walks out of the room. And I think it's a hilarious commercial, right? But that commercial, understanding of why that's funny and why we would hear all that and say, what in the world, is all based on this premise that we all have an understanding of how that should go, right? That we have an understanding of what that conversation should be like if you were having surgery and you asked the nurse, have you worked with Dr. Johnson before, right? What would be the expected answer? Yes, and he's great, right? Whether or not he's really great, that's what we expect to hear, right? That we have all this previous knowledge and understanding, right? They don't tell us the backstory of what this doctor and what he supposedly did to get disbanded or whatever. But us hearing him yell down the hallway, guess who just got reinstated, is enough. We understand enough about the medical world that that triggers something. Wait, why would he need to be reinstated right there? The commercial only works if we have all of this previous knowledge about how the medical system works. If you show that person to somebody in the Amazon who doesn't understand modern medicine, it probably doesn't make much sense to them, and they don't find it probably nearly as funny as we do, right? And all the commercial is built on dialogue, right? Nowhere in the commercial does it say, hey, this is a bad doctor. You wouldn't want this guy doing your surgery. It's all just built on dialogue that's built on all these presuppositions. In many ways, that's how many of the stories in the Old Testament work. They're built on the presupposition that you understand the Pentateuch, that you've read the Pentateuch, that you've read the law, that you've read the covenants that God has given to his people. So that when you hear these conversations, when you see these actions, when you hear these narratives in the rest of the stories, or whether that be in Kings or in the prophets or in the minor prophets, when you read these stories, the writer's not always going to say, hey, look right here, this guy's doing a bad thing. Often he's just going to describe it to you in the same way that the commercial will let you just hear the dialogue. And you yourself realize, oh, that's not right. And so they're going to describe to you what's happening. And if you know the Pentateuch, that's when your alarm bells begin to go off. Like, oh, Okay, yeah, that's not right. That doesn't line up with what God had told him to do. Oh, okay. So the example I gave you last week is in Judges, when the writer of the book of Judges is telling us a story, and the priest was traveling, and he was traveling with his concubine. He doesn't there stop and say, now we all know that's not a good thing. Priests shouldn't have concubines. He just tells us the story, and he expects us to know from the Pentateuch, yeah, that's not right. Already things are off the rails here. It's going to happen over and over and over. So understanding the first 5 books is crucial to having a good foundation for the rest, understanding the rest of the Old Testament, because the narrator's not always going to drop in and tell you this is bad. So it's one of the reasons why atheists will look at the Bible and say, well, the Bible, the Old Testament, promotes polygamy. I would argue, no, the Old Testament doesn't promote polygamy. The Old Testament describes polygamy. It describes people in polygamous relationships. Can anybody find a polygamous relationship in the Old Testament that worked well? No. Where is the description and the prescription for what marriage is supposed to be in the Old Testament? Yeah, it's in Genesis. It's in the creation account. It's in the first marriage that's what a marriage was supposed to be, so that all these other relationships that we see, we're able to judge them against the standard, right? So that when we read about these polygamous relationships, we judge them based on what the standard was, so that just because the Bible describes those things doesn't mean it's prescribing those. And they say, well, nowhere, often in those narratives, nowhere does the narrator stop and say, and so took a third wife, and that was a bad thing. Well, it's because he didn't have to say that. It's because he expects that you would know and read the Pentateuch, so that he can tell you about this, and he's going to expect that you understand the law, that you understand the way that God has designed things. Does that make sense? It's really important that we understand the Pentateuch, because it is in many ways the foundation for the whole of Scripture. So today what we're going to do is we're going to try to make it through the entire book of Genesis. And you've got notes there in front of you, and we're going to break it up into 2 big sections. Chapters 1 through 11 and chapters 12 through 50. So we're going to sort of go through these overview. Obviously, we're not going to be able to hit every story. We're not going to be able to hit every text. But I want you to take your Bible and to just go ahead and open to Genesis 1, and we're going to flip sort of as we go, and we'll read portions. I know I challenged you last week to read the whole book. I hope many of you at least attempted, right? So maybe even if you didn't read all of it, maybe you read some of it. Maybe you read more than you would have. I hope if you did, I hope today will be more fruitful for you as you sort of get the whole picture of what's happening in the book of Genesis. But before we sort of dig in here, can anybody give me, what are some themes that we find in the book of Genesis that are seeds that we're going to see for themes that are going to show up in the rest of the Bible? So what sort of big picture biblical themes that we see throughout the whole Bible, what themes do we discover and find out about in the book of Genesis? And so often they're just little seeds. They're not developed yet, but they're just seeds. Yeah. Our sin nature, what it is, how it affects us. Yeah. What else? God's what? Yeah. I'm going to add with that freedom and responsibility, right? When people make choices and there are consequences with those choices. There are things that come along with that. What else?
Judgment and preservation.
That's a good one. Don't judge my spelling.
Creation.
That's a huge one. What else? Sacrifice is a big one, right? It's going to be developed more as you go through the text. But sacrifice is we see the seed of that theme in the book of Genesis. It's built for us there. Covenant. That's a huge one. What else? Anybody think? Anybody else? Anything else?
Picture of
Redemption. So what I want you to see is I'm not sure that you can find what we would call a main theme of the scriptures that isn't in Genesis, at least in seed form. Right? So maybe not super clear, maybe not super developed, but that the seeds are being planted in Genesis for what's going to flower and what's going to grow. For many of these things, we're going to find them in the garden, or in the new garden, in the new heaven and new earth. Right? These things are going to show back up. These are themes that run all the way through the scriptures that we are getting to see here at the beginning of the book, or at the beginning of the Bible in this first book, that these are there. That it's not, these themes aren't coming in later down the line. That they're being planted. Some of them at the very beginning, from some of the first words of the scripture, are some of these themes. These themes being planted. So, two things we want to keep in mind as we study Genesis. We've already sort of talked about why we should study Genesis, what it teaches us about God, what the foundation that lays for us for the rest of the Bible. That we want to understand the historical context of the book of Genesis. So, in your booklet, I've put sort of an appendix. We just don't have time to really cover this, about who wrote the Pentateuch and when. Most scholars believe that it's Moses. I'm of that agreement. That the Bible generally says that. So you'll see Joshua, Daniel, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, other places credit Moses with writing the Pentateuch, and there's no reason for us to doubt that. There obviously are pieces of the Pentateuch that were written towards the end, that are written after the death of Moses, like writing about his own death. So clearly somebody helped to finish that in. So generally the belief is that Moses compiled and wrote most of the Pentateuch, probably with a compiler coming on at the end. Also, I would argue, also working under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to put all of Moses' work together and to add some things, especially about the death of Moses and things that happened after his death. So you'll see there's lots of reasons that people try to say, well, there's no way that Moses could have written the Pentateuch. We don't have time to delve into that, but if you're interested, you can read that appendix in the back. That'll give you a little more information to help understand what the debate is and why we can be pretty confident Moses wrote it. He wrote it somewhere around 1400. We think probably while they were in the wilderness wandering. He had some time on his hands, so we think that's probably when he wrote, somewhere in that range, just sort of historical context, that they're about to enter into the promised land, and he wants the people to remember all that God has done for them. So he's writing for them this basically history of who they are and history of the world. He's writing for them the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch there. And then the redemptive historical context. So this is something that we're going to come back to over and over and over again, understanding how everything in the Bible fits in the big picture. So if we have creation, fall, longing, redemption, and consummation. So there are lots of different ways that you could name these things. Lots of people use different terminology. This is a simple one. It's not the only one, but I like this one: creation, fall, longing, redemption, consummation. That this is essentially the storyline of the Bible. There was creation, there was a fall, there's a longing, right? There's an anticipation of this redemption that's going to come. The actual redemption comes, and then there's a final consummation that all things are brought together under the Lord Jesus. So understanding if this is the big storyline, if this is the big picture of the Bible, that every book, every story, everything we read, we're trying to place that within that redemptive historical context. So where in this does it fall? Where, on which side of the fall are we? Are we in the longing phase, or this is the redemption phase, this consummation? Placing this individual story within the context of the greater fall. We want to do that with all the scripture, and that's incredibly important to do with the book of Genesis. I want to sort of put a question in your mind. We're not going to answer it right now, but just for you to think about as we study Genesis. I want you to wonder, what would we be missing from the Bible if we didn't have the book of Genesis? And I want you to think about that as we read through it. So go with me to Genesis chapter 1. I want to sort of give you an overview of 1 through 11 real quick, and we're going to read a couple things. Overview: God creates the world. Genesis chapter 1. There's nothing. God creates out of nothing. He creates Adam and Eve. He creates man and woman. He makes them in His image. He puts them in a perfect garden. That He gives them everything they need in order to do what He's called them to do and to proclaim His glory to the ends of the earth. They sin. We don't know how quickly, but it comes in our scriptures pretty quickly, right? We're not given a time frame, but by the time you get to chapter 3, sin enters into the world. There's a fall that comes into the world. And then because of that fall, a curse comes upon both man and creation. That all of creation, Paul says, is groaning under the weight of sin. And yet God provides this hope that there's going to be a redeemer. He's going to put enmity between his seed and her seed, that the seed of the woman's going to crush the head of the serpent, that there is going to be this redemption, right? It's a really, really small seed. It's a really grainy picture of what God gives there in Genesis 3. But there is this redemption. As soon as sin comes into the world, God gives this promise, this hope that there is redemption that's going to come. So then we're following that story. Genesis 1 through 11 is essentially the story of man at large. And when we get to Genesis 12 through 50, we zoom in on particularly on Abraham. And we're working now with one particular family and what's going to grow into one particular nation. But in Genesis 1 through 11, you have sin coming into the world. And then immediately after that, you have the first murder that happens. Cain kills Abel. And then from there, what we see is this things getting worse. It goes from bad to worse, so that you get to Genesis chapter 6, and it says the heart of man was evil. Everybody did what was evil and did what was right in their own eyes. And what's God do? Judges the earth. He sends a flood. And then so God judges the earth. He saves Noah and his family through this flood. They come out of the earth, or they come out of the flood. They get out of the ark. And then everything's happy, right? No. Right? Almost immediately, things begin to go bad again. One of the first things that happens out of the ark is incest, right? It just goes bad really quickly, right? So what we see is that things aren't better on the other side of the fall, or on the other side of that judgment, on the other side of the flood. So much so that you come to the story of Babel, where the people are building the tower. They're going to make a name for themselves. They're going to build this tower, and then God confuses their languages, and God scatters them, God gives them different languages, and spreads them all over the face of the earth. That sort of big picture, all that's happening in chapter 11. So then it's out of that context that God comes to a man named Abram in Ur, which I'll go and put this up, so you can see that in Ur of the Chaldeans, way down in Babylonia. That's out of that context that God calls a single man and says, I'm going to take you and I'm going to give you a land. So let's sort of work back through Genesis. Let's go back to chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning on the first day. So what we learn from the very beginning is that there exists an eternal and self-sufficient God who by sheer verbal fiat has created the entire universe and all that is in it in order to display his glory. The Bible just starts with a bang. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God was always there, right? God didn't make himself. There was nothing, and God creates with just his word everything there is. And that's always been amazing to me. It's been even more amazing to me as a father when I can get my kids to do things. Right? Just saying my words, I just can't do much in my house with just words, right? I want to please go pick up your room. Nothing happens. Right? God just speaks the words, and out of nothing comes a universe. God makes everything that there is. And so I want you to see real quickly who is God, verses 1 through 25 there in Genesis chapter 1. First thing we see, God's eternal. The Bible begins with God. He's already there. He's not created. He's just there. Where did God come from? He's always been there. God is the eternal constant. God is eternal. God is self-sufficient. What does God use in order to create the world? His voice. God doesn't have to get materials. He doesn't need pre-made things. God uses his voice. He's self-sufficient. He has everything he needs. So sometimes this comes up, you'll hear people say things like that God was lonely. And so because God was lonely, he made us. The scriptures are really clear. God is self-sufficient. He does not need us. That God is in communion. God has always, for eternity, been in communion with who? Himself, his Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. God did not make us because he was lonely and thought he just needed some things to keep him busy. God is self-sufficient. God does not need anything from us in that way. God is not a needy God that he would come to us with his needs. God is self-sufficient. God created out of his sheer will. He wanted to create. Not because he needed to, not because he had to, not because he was lonely and needed people, but because God wanted to display his glory. And so he creates us. He creates the entire universe. He created it by the power of his word. Just his very speech. And then at the end there, God is good. It's one of the refrains that you see if you read that creation narrative over and over and over. God created, and he saw that it was good. God's a good God. And so he doesn't make us because he's needy, but that doesn't mean that he's a mean God. It doesn't mean that he's bad, that we see that God is good. He creates things that are generally good. So then the question is, well, then who are we? So go down to verse 26. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image, and in the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So that human beings first, who are we? We are created in the image of God. So what does it mean then to be created in the image of God? You have a soul, we have a conscience, we have intellect, we have reasoning ability. What else? We're the only creature in all the universe that is made in the image of God. We know right from wrong, right? We have capacities to things like love and hate that other creatures don't have, right? We have emotional capacity that other creatures don't have.
But it had some physical stature, you know what I'm saying? Like almost bodily image.
Yeah.
Later on in the Bible it says God was walking in the garden.
Yeah, that there's a physical image when Jesus comes. He comes as a man. So there is a physical component to that. It's always a little fuzzier for us.
In Genesis it said God was
Yeah, God's walking in the garden with them. Yeah. What else?
I think there's the dominion aspect.
Mm-hmm.
There's never going to be a Planet of the Apes situation.
Yeah. God makes them in his image, and he places them in the earth to do what? He says in verse 28, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion. He places them as his viceroys, as his images in the world to essentially be an extension of himself in the world. One of the things you think about, we don't really deal with temples in this same way, and especially in America. But if you were to go to other places, if you were to go to ancient Greece or Rome, and you were to go into the temple to Artemis, what are you going to find in the temple to Artemis there at the center? You're going to find a statue of Artemis, right? What's going to be all over the temple of Artemis? Images of Artemis, right? That you find the image of the god in the temple. That there is a real sense in which what God has done in creating the world, he has created a temple. He has created a place where he is to be worshiped, where his glory is to be proclaimed. And what has God done in that temple? He's placed his image. He's placed his viceroys. He's placed those that bear his stamp so that they will proclaim his glory to the ends of the earth. So that, sort of skipping ahead here a little bit, but what human beings are supposed to do, they're supposed to exercise lordship and care for the earth. They are to image God, meaning they are to display God and his glory, that they were to push the boundaries of Eden to cover the whole earth. That if Eden was a place where God was known and worshiped and his glory was perfectly displayed, that the command given to Adam and Eve is be fruitful, multiply, and push the boundaries over the whole earth. Fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over it as my image bearers, displaying the glory of God. So part of what it means to be made in the image of God is it means that there is a command with that. There is a responsibility that we should reflect God. Right? That perfectly, if we were to live our lives perfectly, we should be a perfect reflection of God. Now, there are attributes, I think Tanya taught on this in her class, None Like Him. There are attributes that God has that we don't have, right? So there are two types of attributes. There are communicable attributes of God, meaning things that we can share, things that we can also have, and incommunicable attributes, attributes that belong to God only, that when we say we're made in the image of God, it doesn't mean we have those attributes or can have those attributes. So what might be an incommunicable attribute, something that belongs to God, that is true of God, that is not true of us? Omniscience, right? That's an incommunicable attribute, belongs to God. Another one. Omnipresence. God's everywhere. We're not. We're in a particular spot. Sovereignty, right? It belongs to God. It doesn't belong to us. Right? But what are some communicable attributes that belong to God that should be true of us and can be true of us? Love. Creativity. Faithfulness. Right? Sorry, go ahead. Reasoning, right? There are all sorts of attributes that belong to God that he has endowed us with that in creating Adam and Eve and giving them a perfect environment, the goal was that they would display his glory over all the face of the earth. That the Garden of Eden was never meant to stay just there. That they're supposed to subdue the whole earth. They're to be fruitful and multiply and have dominion over everything, so that the Garden of Eden would fill the whole earth. So if you think about even Habakkuk 2:14, there's this prophecy that when the Messiah comes, that there's going to be a day when the glory of God fills the earth like the waters cover the sea. That was the goal of creation, is that the glory of God would fill the earth, that Adam and Eve, as his image bearers, would bear his image in his world, in his creation, displaying his glory as those who are acting as his viceroys, having dominion over the creation that he has made, because he's given them dominion. That was the goal. And so that even here at the beginning of Genesis, one of the seeds that we didn't mention, when we think about Jesus, we understand the Bible paints him in this picture as the prophet, priest, and king, that he serves all three roles. And what we know that in the life of Israel, that these are three separate roles. There's prophets, there's priests, and there's kings. You don't get to do all three. It's one of the reasons when you read the story of Saul, and Saul is supposed to be waiting on the prophet to come offer the sacrifice, and Saul doesn't wait, and he offers the sacrifice. Why do we know that's bad? Because we've read the Pentateuch, and we understand that kings aren't supposed to do that. Kings aren't priests. They're not prophets. They're kings. What we see here is a seed of that in the book of Genesis, that prophets are those who speak with God. Adam and Eve are in the garden, and who's walking in the garden with Adam and Eve? God. They speak with God. They have an intimate relationship with God, right? That priests are those who mediate the presence and the power of God to the rest of the people on the planet, right? That's what priests are supposed to do. They're the connection between God and the people in the Old Testament. What are Adam and Eve? Their connection between God and all of creation. They're to take dominion over all the world, that his glory might be displayed, that they are priests in a sense. And what do kings do? They rule. What are Adam and Eve doing? Exercising dominion. That there is this seed here, that in this first Adam, he is in a real sense a prophet, a priest, and a king, in a way that when the new Adam comes, in Jesus, he is going to be the perfect prophet, priest, and king, that he restores all those things. So they are made in the image of God. That's who we are. We're made to image God. And then what is the world? The world was created as a place of rest and peace, where the glory of God was to cover the whole earth. That was the goal. That was the goal of humanity, was that the whole earth would be a place where God is worshiped and glorified. That you can see there on your next page. How do we relate to each other? That we were created to have a restful, peaceful relationship with each other. And if we see the first marriage there between a man and a woman, it was made to be a good thing. Right? That one of the things we see when the fall happens and God pronounces the curse is that one of the places where that the wheels are going to first come off in the life of men and women is in their marriages. It's part of what the sin is going to do, but marriage was made to be a good thing, that we were made to have a relationship with each other that's restful and peaceful. It's meant to be a good thing. How are we to relate to God? Go to Genesis chapter 2. Verse 15, he says, "And the Lord took the man and put him in the garden to work it, and to work it and to keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, You must surely eat of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall die." So that God is made to be in relationship with God, and that relationship includes worship, includes glorifying God, but definitely includes obedience. As he puts the men and women in the garden, or he puts Adam and Eve there, he gives them a command. You're to do this and not this. I've given you everything that you need in order to be fruitful and to multiply and to fill the earth. I've given everything you need in order to glorify me. I'm asking you, don't do this. Don't eat of this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That what he gives them includes this idea of obedience, that they're to both worship and obey him. So let's think about what would we be missing if the Bible stopped at Genesis 2? We'd be missing the fall. If we stopped at the end of Genesis 2, everything would be great. You'd have man and woman given everything they need. God has put them in a perfect environment. God has said, I want you to be fruitful, multiply, have dominion over everything, over all of creation. All of creation is in subject to man and woman, and that you're going to display my glory over all the face of the earth. You've got this beautiful picture. What a great thing. The reason that matters is because here's what's happening. As soon as the fall comes in Genesis chapter 3, what the storyline of the Bible is doing is telling us how we're going to get back to chapters 1 and 2, but in an even better way. Does that make sense? So Genesis 1 and 2 is this perfect picture. This is what it looks like to be in relationship with God. And it's going to fall in Genesis chapter 3. And the rest of the storyline is telling us how is God going to restore us? How can we ever get back to this? And what we're going to see if you go all the way to the end of the Bible, you go all the way to the book of Revelation, right? And there's a new heaven and a new earth. What is the new heaven and new earth? It's a garden. Adam and Eve are in a garden with a tree in the middle and a river running through it. You go to the end of the book of Revelation, where are the people of God? They're in a garden with a tree in the middle and a river running through it. That it's a new Eden, right? That God has restored the people, but in an even better way than the beginning. Does that make sense? So that the story of redemption is telling us, how do we get back to what God has created? How do we get back to this place where we are in perfect relationship with God and can display His glory for all eternity? How can we get back there? That's the story that the Old Testament is telling. One side note, one of the questions that always sort of comes up as we think about sort of Genesis chapter 3, why does God allow sin? God created all things. God created man and woman. God gave them choices. God's sovereign over all things. Both of those things are true. Men and women have real choices. We're really responsible for those things. And yet God is also sovereign. I think the Bible teaches both of those things. And so the question becomes, well, why would God allow sin? And the short answer is we don't know. We don't know why allow this scenario versus any others that God could have brought about or that God could have allowed. Why does it happen like this? We don't know for sure. But one thing we do know, that the Bible teaches again and again and again, is that God is about displaying His glory. And so that something that I think as I read the Scriptures, if God is about displaying His glory, that somehow allowing things to work out the way that they have must display God's glory better than if things had always been perfect and never had to be restored. Right? That there is some unique aspect of God and His glory that is displayed in redemption and in judgment that would not have been displayed had there never been a fall. Does that make sense? God never says, here's exactly why the things worked out the way they did. But if God is about displaying His glory, that there are unique pieces of who God is that are displayed in judgment and in redemption that would not have been displayed had there never been a fall, had man remained in a perfect state. That we would know about the sovereignty of God, we would know about the lordship of God, but we would not know about the mercy of God if men had never fallen. We would not know about the grace of God if men had never fallen, if we were in a perfect state. Right? There are all sorts of things. We would not know in an in-depth way about the holiness of God in the way that we do because we see the judgment of God. Does that make sense? So, big picture, we don't know for sure, but there are ways that we can sort of help to think through that. So, Genesis chapter 3, fall comes in, sin comes into the world. Our first parents, they choose to set themselves up as rivals, as equals with God. They disobey Him. They choose not to believe His word. Satan twists His words and says, there's no reason you should worry. There's no judgment that's going to come. God said you're going to die, but you're not going to die. One, we got to remember that the prohibition in Genesis 2, 15, and 17 was for their good. Because God cares for them. Right? It was for their good. And what does this serpent do? He twists it and makes it seem as if God is working against them. The reason God doesn't want you to do this is because He is keeping good things from you. God doesn't care about you. God cares about keeping Himself above you, keeping you under His thumb. You are just like God. You can be just like God. Just eat this fruit. So He tempts them. Sin comes into the world. And then immediately the curse comes. Immediately judgment comes. God comes into the garden. He finds them. They're hiding from Him. He says, where are you? Which is not, I don't think, a question of location. God's not wondering which bush Adam and Eve are behind, but I almost think it's more of a question of like, what are you doing? Or you ever just walk in and your kid is in the middle of something and he's like, what are you doing? Right? And I can visually see what they're doing, but it's a different question, right? Like, what in the world are you thinking? God comes and says, like, where are you? What has happened? Well, how did you get here? And then He pronounces the curse. He pronounces curse on man and woman, and I want you to notice the way that the curse comes. So He first pronounces the curse on the serpent. We'll talk about that in a minute. But He pronounces the curse on the woman. Verse 16, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing, and in pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband. Right? I like the way that the ESV translates that. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. So He says to the woman, one, what's the command to Adam and Eve? Be fruitful and multiply. And now what just got harder? being fruitful and multiply, that now it's going to happen only in pain. It's gonna be in pain that you're going to bring forth children. And now this relationship that was meant for your good, that was meant for you to be able to be together and be fruitful and multiply, now it's going to be a source of tension, that your desire shall be contrary to your husband. Essentially, you're going to want his place, and your temptation is going to want to be in your husband's place, and your husband's temptation is going to be to rule over you in a harsh manner. Right? That this is where the wheels are going to come off in marriage. So now, because of sin, the very thing that you were called to do just gets a lot harder. Being fruitful and multiplying now is really difficult. And then with the man, right, he is to subdue the whole earth. All the earth is in subjection to him. And he says, because you've listened to the voice of your wife, eaten of the tree which I commanded you not to eat, cursed is the ground because of you, and in pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So Adam's job just got harder. Feeding his family. What used to be in subjection to him is now in rebellion. Right? Can you go out into the woods and play with bears? Once, yeah. You could go out into the woods and play with bears. Right? Is all of creation in subject to us? No. You know what's really funny? Go read the story of Jesus, and he goes out into the wilderness, right? He comes up out of the waters of baptism, and he goes out into the wilderness, and they make a point to tell us that that's where the wild animals are. Jesus got no worry about wild animals. He's the true Adam. Everything is in subjection to him, right? That's what Adam was supposed to be. And yet now even the ground itself is in rebellion against Adam. That it's going to fight against him. That his very job now is now made impossible on his own. He can't do the very thing that God has called him to do without the help of God, because of the way that sin has cursed the earth. And then let's go back up to this curse that he puts on the serpent. He says, because you've done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all the beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. Here's the main verse, verse 15. I will put enmity, right? I will put war. Conflict between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. All right, so I've given you there in your book 3 levels of enmity, 3 levels of conflict. The first is between the serpent and the woman, right? So that Satan is the enemy of the human race. This is an important thing. He says, I'm putting enmity between you and the woman. That Satan is our enemy. There is a sense in which God is still saying to Satan, these people still belong to me. They're still my creation. They still bear my image. So yes, we're cursed. Yes, we're broken. But we're still image bearers. God is saying, we're still picking sides here. You're still on my side. You still belong to me. You're still my image bearers. Satan is an enemy to us. He's not a friend. I mean, then to be a friend of Satan is to be an enemy of God. So God is at least saying, first level of enmity. Second level is between the serpent's seed and the woman's seed. All right, so the seed of the woman is the place of life, and the seed of the serpent is the place of death. That if the first level of enmity there is mainly physical, mainly just mankind, that this one is more spiritual. So that what we see throughout the moving from this point, from Genesis through the rest of the Old Testament, is this battle between 2 different types of people. Those who are seed of the woman, those who belong to God spiritually, and those who are seed of the devil, seed of the serpent, who spiritually do not belong to God and are enemies to God. All right, so you remember this is language that even Jesus picks up. So what does Jesus say to the Pharisees? You lie. Why? Because you're like your father who lies. He says to the Pharisees, you brood of vipers. You snake children. You're seeds of the serpents. You're not seeds of the woman. You don't belong to God. That there's this tension. So immediately coming out of Genesis chapter 3, what's the first battle we see? Seed of the woman, seed of the serpent. And who wins that one? Seed of the serpent. He kills the seed of the woman. Right? That he doesn't love God. And he kills the one who loves God. And so this is the harrowing question that's going to move throughout all of the Old Testament, is how is the seed of the woman going to survive? Is the seed of the serpent going to conquer the seed of the woman? Right? There's going to be this conflict. That's why Cain and Abel matters. Because it seems like immediately the seed of the woman has been defeated. Right? And then that's why it matters at the end that God says, but God gave her another son. God gave her Seth. All right, so third level enmity was between the one seed of the woman and the serpent. So that we're going to see this narrowing, that it's just not just going to be this main enmity between your offspring and her offspring. And notice the end of verse 15. He's moved here to a A third person singular pronoun. Not they in a broad sense, but he's speaking now of one offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Jesus refers to this passage. Paul refers to this passage. Paul especially draws out the fact that he refers to he, the one. It's a singular. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So, not only do we have this big category of seed of the woman versus seed of the serpent, that within that there is going to be one main seed of the woman. There is going to be an individual who's going to come, who's going to be from the seed of the woman, who's going to belong to God, who is going to crush the head of the serpent. He's not going to be unscathed, right? He's going to crush his head, you're going to bruise his heel. But there is this hope then, that there's going to be this one who is coming. So we talked about this last week. You get down to the parts that we always skip. When you come out of Genesis chapter 4, you go into 5 and 6. And what you see is all these genealogies. And at the end of the genealogies, you read, and he died, and he died, and he died, and he died. Why? It's a reminder. This guy's not the seed of the woman. This guy's not the one who's going to crush the head of the serpent. He's dead. Judgment has come to him. He can't be the one who's going to crush the head of the serpent because he's in a grave. Or that's the refrain that's coming over and over and over again. All right, let's keep moving. That makes sense? That main promise, main enmity. Genesis 4 and 5, Cain, Abel, the wages of sin. Then in a real way, the rest of the Bible is the outworking of Genesis 3:15. Is the outworking of this promise. We talked about that, and then he died, that God is going to continue this godly line in Seth. That part of what's happening in the Old Testament is this question again and again and again. Is the seed of the woman going to survive? Can the seed of promise, this one that's going to come, can it survive barrenness? Can it survive enemies? Can it survive famine? Can it survive war? All these things are going to come against this seed of the woman and this ultimate promise that there would be one seed who would redeem them. All these things are going to threaten that seed, and this is the story of God bringing his people through it. So you get to Genesis chapter 6 through 9:17, which is the flood, that even partial of judgment in the world, right? God saves Noah and his family, so it's not a full judgment, but it doesn't end the world of sin. That in many ways, that if you that the wrath of God, the judgment of God, is a uncreation. God is decreating the world. And that when God brings Noah up out of the ark, that it is in many ways a recreation of the world. So if you go to flip forward to 8:17, God brings Noah up out of the earth. He says, "Bring out with you every living thing that is with you, of all flesh, birds and animals and creeping things that creep on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth and be fruitful and multiply." So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his son's wife with him, and every beast, every creeping thing, every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out by families from the ark. There's this recreation that God now is refilling the earth, and even the command that He gives to Noah is that he would be fruitful and multiply. Right? He makes this promise that he's never again going to judge the earth by water. Again, the judgment will still come, but not by water. So there is this recreation, same command given to Noah to be fruitful and multiply. This is where, if you were in our sort of how to study the Bible class, which I think is going to come up again next year, where the idea of typology really matters, which when we talk about big story arc, and then you talk about all these little stories in here that sort of mirror this big arc, that's essentially typology. So when we say typology, what we mean are events, institutions, or people that give us categories that point us towards Jesus, and which Jesus is the fulfillment of. And so in typology, you have both continuity, right, sameness with the fulfillment, and some discontinuity, so some differences. So one of the examples that we might think of here of typology is this flood, right? So that God judges the earth by this flood. He saves one family through the ark, that they're redeemed out of the ark. They're given a new command to be fruitful and multiply. That it's creating for us this type of redemption that's going to come to the people of God through judgment. Remember last week we talked about it's not excluding people from judgment, but God saving them through that, creating this model for us of God saving his people through judgment and calling them to be fruitful and multiply. Right? So we're going to see this come up again with the Exodus, right? God's going to save his people through judgment. He's going to call them to be fruitful and multiply. Right? We see this type fulfilled even in the New Testament for God that's going to save us through judgment by the cross. And the Great Commission is, if nothing else, the Great Commission is a command for us to do what? To be fruitful and multiply, not physically in the same way, but spiritually, that we're to make disciples of all the nations, that we're to be fruitful and multiply now spiritually as believers, that we're to grow. So that when we talk about typology, this is where we think about like the King David. David is the anointed king of Israel. He's the one that fights Israel's battles. He speaks with the Lord. He's in that way an emissary for God, for the people of God. That David is a type of Christ. He helps us point us forward to the one who's going to be the true king of Israel. All right, so it's beginning for us these categories that are going to progress and find full fulfillment in ultimately in Christ and in Revelation. Let's keep going. Genesis 10 and 11. They come out of the ark. We see the full descendants of Noah. Chapter 11 is the Tower of Babel. Why? All right, so the people of Babel say, let's build us a tower to the sky. Let's all be together, and let's build a tower, all right, so that we will not be scattered. Verse 4, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its tops in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the whole face of the earth. Right here, the writer of Genesis is assuming that you've already read the first 10 chapters. Why is it wrong for them to make a tower, to make a name for themselves so that they won't be dispersed? Yeah, it's literally the exact opposite of what humans are supposed to do. What are humans supposed to do? Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth with whose glory? God's glory. And so they say, well, let's bunch up so we won't be dispersed, and we'll make a name for ourselves. It's literally the exact opposite thing of what God has called them to do. So God scatters them. God changes their languages so that they can't speak each other's language, so they're confused, and God scatters them over the whole face of the earth. So even when we talked about typology, these things that are pushing forward, right? So there's a day here in Genesis 11 where the people, their languages are confused, and they're scattered over the face of the earth. Where do you see the reverse of this, the beginning of the reverse of Babel? Pentecost. There's a day when now people are gathered together around the early church, and they can hear each other's languages. And one day, Revelation 5 says that one day around the throne of God, there's going to be people from where? Every tribe and language and people and nation. Right, that there is this recreation, this undoing of what God does in Genesis chapter 11. Right, so that Genesis 1 and 2 is the perfect design and the aim of all history. This is what we're getting back to. And then 3 through 11 is the nature and pervasiveness of our sin. Right, that it just does not go away, that we keep sinning. And then so we come into chapter 12. Any questions about 1 through 11? The day of Pentecost, yes.
When it talks about everybody will be able to understand the language, does that kind of have relation to each other? Pentecost and just kind of
And every knee bowing.
every tongue confessing.
Yes, to some degree. And then where Paul says every knee will bow, every tongue confess. I don't think Paul means there that everybody will be saved. So Revelation 5, around the throne, those people are saved. Around the throne of God, those are those that the Lamb has saved, that belong to him. But Paul's right, one day every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. That means saved people who belong to him will bow, but that means there will be a day when even those who had rejected Jesus will have to bow the knee, that there'll be no, on Judgment Day, there'll be no denying that Jesus is Lord. So for those who are believers, it's going to be a really happy bowing of the knee. And for those who aren't, it's going to be an awful thing. The judgment of God has now come upon them, that they can't deny it, that Jesus is who he said he was, that he was Lord. They have to declare that. For us, that's a good thing, because he's our Savior. But if you've not trusted Jesus, that's a bad thing. But every tongue confess, right? I think we'll be able to hear that. I think we'll be able to understand that.
You know how there were some falls with creation, it was some way before the fall and after the fall it was different. The different languages, is that one of them? Like there being language walls.
Yep, that comes from that. Yeah, chapter 11, Genesis chapter 11, where God confuses their language, gives them different language. And that's partly because of sin, because of their own desire to do the opposite of what God called them So there is a reverse of that in the new heaven and new earth, that we can all understand each other. We won't have to learn different languages, that we can all speak and understand. So let's go Genesis chapter 12. This is where we see this narrowing of the seed, right? So that God is making a gracious covenant with one man and his descendants, which will bless the entire world. And in this covenant, God has promised to be their God, and that they will be his special people, that they will live in the place of his choosing, and that they will enjoy a unique relationship with him, and that they will be under his rule. So this here gives us the idea the kingdom of God is God's people in God's place under God's rule. And so God comes to this man named Abram, Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, and he says, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So what's happening here in Genesis 12, if you've got this promise that there's this seed of the woman, right? This individual seed. In 1 through 11, all we know is that it can come from this. It's going to come from this big category of mankind, right? Seed of the woman. And what Genesis 12 is doing is saying, it's not just going to come from anybody. Now God is saying, this seed is going to come through your family. You're going to be a great nation. And in you, verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That the promise now is going to come through Abraham. That God is narrowing. I'm going to make a people for myself. That you're going to be my people. I'm going to be your God. He's saying that this is going to come through Abraham, who at this point is just Abram. So it's just this narrowing of the promise. This is probably about 2000 BC. God calls Abraham from Ur. He calls him up to the area of Canaan, which if you look like Shechem, Damascus, Tyre, Babylon, that main area, you'll see the Egyptian empire down at the bottom. This is that main area is the area of Canaan. It's where God is calling Abraham. He says, I'm going to give you this place. If you want to sort of know chapters, the life of Abram is roughly chapters 12 through 23. His son Isaac is roughly 24 to 28, and then Joseph is roughly 29 through 50. Joseph takes up a big piece of the book. So that God, one, promises them a place. He says, I'm going to give you land. Remember what happens in Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve sin? At the end of the judgments, what does God do? He kicks them out of the land. He kicks them out. They're not allowed to be there anymore. God says, I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to give you a place that's going to belong to you. And again, this is a type. This is pointing us forward. At the end of all things, when Jesus comes back, and at the full consummation of history, will the people of God have the promised land? Yeah. Will it be just that? No, what will it be? All the earth, right? We're not just getting Eden back, we're getting the full deal. We're getting even better. So he's saying, I'm promising you this land, not because this is the final thing, not because this strip in the Middle East is the final thing, but it's a piece, it's a picture that's pointing you to one day the whole earth is going to be yours. One day there's going to be a new heaven and new earth. All of it is going to be a place where the glory of God covers the earth like the waters cover the sea. Right? This is what Hebrews 11 says when you go through read the stories of those who trusted God. That they trusted God because they believed there was a better city coming down the line. All right? So God's place, God's people, right? This seed of the promise now is going to come through Abram. That the seed of the woman is going to come through him, and that all this is going to happen by faith. So if you go over quickly to Genesis chapter 15, I believe verse 6, God is reiterating his covenant with Moses, and in verse 6 it says, and he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. This is what Paul does in Galatians. Paul refers to this in Romans chapter 4 and Galatians chapter 3 to say, from the very beginning, how were the people in the Old Testament saved? By faith. Abraham believed the Lord and he counted it to him as righteousness. Right? So even understanding the law and the sacrificial system, that this is what the writer of the book of Hebrews says. He said, we know that the blood of bulls and goats and rams can never take away our sins. That was never the primary purpose, the primary purpose of the law and the sacrificial system was what? That the people would trust God. This is what Abraham does. He believes the Lord, it was counted to him as righteousness. So he's saved by faith, and that they're under God's rule. So in Genesis 15, 7 through 21, we see God cut a covenant with Abraham. He makes this covenant with him. The word there that's in the Hebrew, it's barid. When you make a covenant in the Old Testament, you cut a covenant. And so what happens is God reiterates his covenant, reiterates his promises to Abraham and says, I'm going to do this. And he puts Abraham essentially into a deep, deep sleep. Abram sees what's going on. God takes all these animals, and he cuts them in half, and he lines them up. This is how you would make a covenant. You would cut the animal, you would line them up, and the two parties would walk in between the animals as they agreed to their covenant. And what they're saying is, if I break the covenant, may what happened to these animals happen to me. Right? So you're cutting a covenant. You're saying we're making a covenant with each other. So in Genesis chapter 15, God cuts a covenant with Abraham, and it says, verse 17, and when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between those pieces. Why did God appear as a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch? I don't know. Right, I've read a lot on it. No one has a great answer. Right? There are theories about why. No one has a really good answer why those things. Right? Who doesn't pass through the animals? Abram. Only one person passes through the animals. Only one person does it. It's God. So you notice that when God makes the covenant with Abraham, it is a one-way covenant. God's saying, I'm going to do this. Right? There are going to be things that come later on as God demands obedience. As God says, here's your part of the covenant. Here's what you're going to do. I'm going to be your God. You're going to be my people. Here's what it looks like to be my people. But when God comes and ratifies the covenant with Abram, he does it, and he does it alone. He says, I will make this happen. I'm going to do that. It is without, at the beginning, it is without obligation. God says, I will do this. I am going to make a great nation out of you. You're going to even be in exile. You're going to be in Egypt for 400 years. But don't worry, I'm going to bring you up. I am going to do this. I'm going to keep my promises to you that you're going to come back and you're going to have this great land. So Abram has this son. The covenant promises are passed to Isaac in chapter 26. He has this son named Isaac. Right? This is why the story of the near sacrifice of Isaac matters. If Abraham is the seed, he is the seed of promise. The seed of promise is going to come through him. The Redeemer is going to come through him. He waits a long time. He can't have kids. Barrenness is going to kill the seed. But God says, no, barrenness can't stop the seed of promise from coming. Right? But in that meantime, what son does Abraham have? What's his first son's name? Ishmael. And he says to God, take Ishmael. Let Ishmael be the child of promise. And God says, no, I'm not going to take Ishmael. It's going to be Isaac. So when Abraham finally has Isaac, and God says to Abram, I want you to take your son up on the mountain, and I want you to sacrifice him. Right, this is not God simply just thinking, well, what would be an awful thing for me to make Abraham do? What would be the hardest thing to do? I'm going to just give him this random test. I'm going to just give him this awful thing to do. He has already told Abram, Isaac is the child of promise. The promise to redeem people is going to come through Isaac. So when he says to Abram, I want you to take Isaac up to the mountain, and I want you to sacrifice him, what is God doing? He's testing, do you believe the promise? Do you believe that even death cannot stop me from fulfilling my promise? Right? So that I fully believe that Abraham expected, as he was sacrificing Isaac, he expected that if need be, the Lord would raise Isaac from the dead. Because the Lord cannot leave Isaac dead, for if he leaves Isaac dead, then the Lord is a liar. The Lord has said the promise is coming through Isaac. So that's what he's saying. Abraham, do you trust that even death cannot stop the promise from coming? Right? What a picture that is of Jesus, right? That even death can't stop the promise. That the Father sacrifices his Son, and when it all looks like all is lost, that even death is conquered, that the promise may come to us, that we may be redeemed. This is what God is doing in Abraham. It's not a random test. That the promise is coming through Isaac. He's already been told that. Right? So this promise is supposed to come through Isaac. The question is, do you trust the Lord? Do you trust the promises of the Lord? From Isaac we have Jacob. The promise is passed to Isaac in chapter 26. He has two sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau is the older of the sons, and Jacob is the younger of the sons. Jacob ultimately is the one who is the child of promise. So here's the interesting thing. One, Esau, you would expect, is the older son. Jacob is the younger. Jacob is the one who ends up being the child of promise. And we might think, well, it's because Jacob was a great guy, right? Well, I'm not going to ask you I don't want to put you on the spot. But if you read through the book of Genesis this week, you saw neither guy was really that great of a guy. They both did some pretty terrible things. They both sinned in some pretty significant ways. And this is the point that Paul makes in God in Genesis 25, 19 to 34, that Paul picks up on in Romans 9, 10, and 11, when he says that the work of God is due to grace. It's not due to our work. Why did God choose Jacob and not Esau? Because it was his will to do so, not because one had done something better than the other one. Both were pretty sinful guys, but so that God's glory might be displayed. It was the will of God that he would do that he chose to make Jacob the child of promise, Jacob the seed of the promise, rather than Esau. We don't have time to go into all of that, but it tells us, even here at the very beginning of the Bible, that what comes to us from God is all of grace. We don't work for anything from God. It's got to be grace. We can't earn it. That Jacob becomes the child of promise not because he earned it, but because of grace. So Jacob has 12 sons. Reuben, with his wife Leah. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun. He has 2 with her handmaiden, Zilpah, Gad and Asher. He has 2 with Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin, and then 2 with Rachel's handmaiden, Bilhah, Dan and Naphtali. So he has 12 sons. Those are the 12 sons of Jacob. God changes Jacob's name to Israel. And what happens to his son Joseph? He's sold into slavery. Elizabeth was telling me this story the other day. She's 4. She came home for her classes with her story, and she was like, "Yeah, Dad, they put Joseph in the well, and he was there for 20 weeks, and he died." Work on that again. They put him in the well. They eventually take him up out of the well. He doesn't die. He's not there for 20 weeks. They bring him out of the well. He ends up going to Egypt. And the whole back half of the book of Genesis is the narrative of Joseph. Joseph rises to prominence in Egypt. That there's this famine in the land. What God is showing you is that even famine, even injustice, when he's sold into slavery, when he's put into jail unjustly, when he helps people and they forget about him and he's left in jail for 2 more years, all these things, none of these things can threaten the promise that God is going to work. So he brings the people back. Through Joseph, he brings the whole family up out of the land of Canaan, down into Egypt, in order to preserve them during the time of famine so that the promise will not die. And so the question at the end of all that, one, if you haven't read the Joseph story, I would encourage you at least go read that, is that we get to the end of that, and the thought is, the seed of promise is going to have to be Joseph, right? The guy gets more ink in the book of Genesis than any other character. He rises to promise, second in power in Egypt, only below Pharaoh. This guy is the guy of promise. This is who the seed is going to come through. And who does the seed actually come through? Judah. That Joseph is not the seed of promise. That the seed of the promise comes through Judah. And what's interesting to me, if you remember the story of Jacob loved, of his 2 wives, who did Jacob love? Rachel, right? It's to me one of the most humorous verses in all the Old Testament. Jacob thinks he's marrying Rachel. He gets tricked, and they give he gets Leah instead. He doesn't know that. It's dark. And it says they basically go into the tent on their wedding night, and in the morning, I just love the language of the Old Testament. They wake up, and it says, and behold, it was Leah. They're just like, what in the world? So he's now married to Leah. That causes problems because he doesn't love her. He loves Rachel. And he eventually marries Rachel, and there is tension between Leah and Rachel, right? Remember, polygamy in the Old Testament doesn't work well. There is this tension, right? That Rachel is the wife whom he loves. He does not love Leah. And yet, when I named all the sons to you of Jacob, who had most sons? Leah did. Leah has 6. Rachel has 2. And where does the child of promise come? Not from the wife he loves, but from the one he hates, from the one he doesn't like. Comes from Leah, comes from the line of Judah, who, by the way, isn't because he's a great guy. Right? If you read the storyline, Judah does some pretty awful things. Right? It's because God in his sovereignty says Judah is the one who the line is going to come through. It's going to come through him. He's not the oldest, and yet God is going to bring the line through him. That Judah's descendants will be the child of promise. Genesis 49, his hand is going to be on the neck of his enemies. That he's going to be a king. He's going to be a ruler. The scepter will never depart from between the feet of Judah. So let's go real quickly to the very end of the book of Genesis. Now let's see, where does the story end? The death of Joseph. And so Joseph, verse 26, the very last chapter 50. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. This is the storyline of Genesis. God's promised people. He's promised he's going to make them a great nation. He's going to give them land. He's going to be their king. He's going to rule over them. And through these people, he's going to bring a promised child, a promised seed, who all the earth is going to be redeemed through this one. And yet, where are they? They're stuck in Egypt. Where's Joseph? He's in a coffin in Egypt. We're going to see this next week, but I want you to notice as I challenge you to read the book of Exodus this week. You come into the book of Exodus. We might be tempted, if this were your first time reading through the Bible, to think, well, that's it. It's done. They're in Egypt. They're not going to get back to the promised land. They're stuck there. Joseph is dead. Joseph was the one who brought them into prominence. Joseph is lying in a coffin in Egypt. This is where the promise dies. And you come into Exodus chapter 1, and he gives the names of all the sons that had come down into Egypt. And he says that Joseph died, all his brothers, that whole generation died. Verse 7, but the people of Israel were what? Fruitful and increased greatly. What does that sound like? They were fruitful and multiplying. And they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with him. And then verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And that's the last time we hear Joseph's name. It gets the whole back half of the book of Genesis. And isn't it like God to do that? To raise a guy up, and then in one verse, and there arose a new king over Egypt who didn't know Joseph. And that's it. Promise doesn't come through Joseph. It's going to come through Judah. That God is moving the story along. And what we're going to see next week as we work through the book of Exodus, is that in the book of Exodus, how is it that God is going to preserve his people so that the promise may come? They're slaves in Egypt. They're about to be crushed by an evil king who wants to wipe them off the face of the earth. How is it that the seed of the promise is going to survive? That they're going to ever make it back to the promised land? All right, any questions about Genesis? We didn't cover much, so... Yeah, there's the heavens are going to come down. There's an old gospel song that says this earth ain't my home, I'm just a passing through. I heard an old preacher say once, heaven ain't going to be my home, I'm just going to be passing through, because heaven's coming down. That it's one day there's going to be a new creation, a new heaven and a new earth that's going to come. God's going to remake everything. I would think so. Yeah. Exactly what it will look like, I don't know. But it'll be good. Yeah, I'm assuming, what kind of buildings we'll have, I don't know, but it'll be good. All right, I encourage you, the book of Exodus, you can read in about 2.5 hours. So I would encourage you at some point this week, take some time to read through it. Yeah. So there's a huge argument. I'll tell you what I think. That phrase, sons of God, shows up in other places in the Old Testament. Predominantly, the main spot, I think it's 2 other places. The main spot is in the book of Job and then in a psalm. Both times that it shows up, both of the other places in the Old Testament where that Hebrew phrase, sons of God, shows up, it refers to angels. So when Satan comes before the throne of God in the book of Job to accuse Job and to say, I want to put him on trial, he comes with the sons of God. He comes with the angels before the throne of God to say, Job doesn't really love you, he just loves your stuff. Right? And the same thing, and I forget which psalm it is, but it talks about the sons of God coming before the council of God. Right? So I think they're angelic beings that are fallen, that are this, and this is the messed upness of the world. I think it's one thing. I think they're angelic beings that are fallen, that are somehow having relationships with women. And that sounds super weird. And I think the part of the reason why that sounds super weird is it's supposed to tell us how messed up stuff was. You're like in chapter 6, and it's this messed up already that God has to judge the whole earth. Now, I say that, I could be wrong. If I'm wrong, I don't know what they are. Like, if I'm wrong, then if it's not angels, clearly it's something, and it's messed up. It is not it's a sinful thing. Right? So there's lots of theories. The one that makes the most sense to me, because it uses the language in the other place in the Old Testament, that sons of God, it would make sense if it's that in Job and it's that in Psalms. It would make sense to understand it as like that in Genesis chapter 6. But I could be wrong there. I think that's angelic beings who've fallen, like Satan, angelic being who'd fallen, that are somehow having relationships with women. The logistics of that, I don't know how that works, but that it's this sin. That the point is, this is how bad things are. So I think ultimately, even if it's not that, even if it's something else, we can all agree, whatever this is really bad. This is not a good thing. And so even if we can't ever figure that out on this side of heaven, we know at least that part. That's a good question.